Driving into Belfield, North Dakota is like driving into a slice of Ukraine. In town, you have the St. Demetrius Ukrainian Catholic Church and St. John's Ukrainian Catholic Church. To get them, you have to pass Trident Park, which is named after the national symbol of Ukraine. In fact, this entire area of western North Dakota is hugely populated by families of Ukrainian pioneers, people who came over in the early 1900s, late 1800s, drawn by homesteading laws. And it was here that I met Bill Palanick, the son of Agnes Palanick, tireless worker for recognition of the Ukrainian culture here on the Great Plains. He's also a representative of the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame, and he took me and my friend around to go and see the sights, starting with the Ukrainian Pioneer Memorial overlooking the town, as this was the first spot in North Dakota which was settled by Ukrainian pioneers who lived a Spartan lifestyle, oftentimes having to turn over their wagons and dig a hole, waiting for the ground to thaw when they could finally make their houses.
And so this is when they visited in 92?
I think it was 92 or 91, something like that.
They're looking around like, I know this country.
Yeah, my mother was the interpreter for them.
The story behind this cross is a fascinating one. Essentially, the story goes that it marks the location of the first Ukrainian immigrant buried in the area. And from this family that arrived, you had settlements all around it and a large number of Ukrainian churches set up. And it really marked the start of the influence of North Dakotan Ukrainian families coming in and setting up homesteads. So when this original cross began to decay, they felt the need to actually set up a really nice one and an information board to explain to people who were passing by what it was, because they're incredibly proud of their heritage.
This is where the author of the book, Ukrainians in North Dakota, in Their Voices, is buried. And the next time you come here, there'll be a headstone here that'll be engraved that says, "The daughter of immigrants who dedicated her life to preserving the stories and legacies of the Ukrainian immigrants." This is where Agnes Palanick is buried. And at her funeral, there was 3 celebrities who had recently passed away before her. And at her memorial service, I told a hypothetical story that Sean Connery, Eddie Van Halen, and Alex Trebek walked into a bar in heaven. And Agnes Palanick walked in shortly behind him. And Sean Connery looks up and says, "Say, who's your new girl?" And she would have been very impressed with him, his Swedish background, and coming to America and being a successful actor. She would have been very polite to Eddie Van Halen, even though she couldn't relate to his music, but because he came here and couldn't speak a bit of English with his Dutch upbringing, she was very impressed with his success as a musician in the United States. But it would be Alex Trebek who she would gravitate towards because of his Ukrainian background, and she would sit down with him and say, "Whose boy are you? Where did they come from?" That was my mother, Agnes Palanick.
And just down the road from the Pioneer Cross is the St. Demetrius Church, which was moved down the road from its original location in Ukraine. And the Palanick family has a very big presence here. You notice that they've been integral parts of the community since day one. And some of the stories they have about the locals are really inspiring. Our next stop just down the road from the old Ukraina settlement is St. Demetrius, which is a Ukrainian Catholic church that was headed at one time by Father Babersky. And Bill Palanick tells me a little bit about Babersky in the future. I do plan on coming back and visiting his grave and actually talking to the locals about him, because he planted every single one of these trees by hand to shield the church here from the wind. And the church itself was brought from Ukraine after the original one burned down. In the next clip, you'll see the original wooden cross that was on top of the hill that now holds the Pioneer Monument.
priest that was here, that moved this church from Ukraine to here, Father Babersky, planted every single one of these trees, and there's over 7,000 of them. And he received awards from the U.S. Conservation Soil District, and got a lot of acclaim for having planted all these trees.
And when was the church built?
Probably in the, I think this is the one, you're gonna have to look in that book, but I think this is the one that replaced the one that burned down. When they bring a body into a church during the funeral, a lot of times the head will be facing the back of the nave, and because that's how you walk into the church. And he was a priest, so they had him just the opposite way. And his funeral was at St. Demetrius Church, and it was in January. And they had it was an open casket, and it was a cloudy day, but throughout the whole entire service, every now and then the sun would shine on his face. And it was just so amazing. And if I've got a video of his funeral where you scroll through it and you can see the sun popping on his face all the time, and it's like it didn't even move. It was just a crazy observation. And then when they came here, they shot video here too, and they had a tent and they had the prayers, and they lowered the casket into the ground. And the very last thing in that video was they panned up to the trees, and there's just a starburst in the sky, the sun. And it was just so, I read so much into it that he is now in the same soil that hold the roots of all these trees that he planted. And that has a special meaning to me. It really does. He had a big impact on my life. He really, really did. He continues to today. And there's so many, the story about the dictionary, the English-Latin dictionary, the finding his video of, and finding the interview that my mom did with him, and I look at those as kind of a sign that I need to preserve his history, and I need to show as many people what his legacy is all about that I can. And it's kind of a mission. It's kind of like what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what that means, but something I think about often. He was quite a man.
It was really very heartwarming to get Bill Palanick's thoughts on his old friend, Father Babersky. He sounded like a really good guy. He would go riding on his motorcycles, and he was an outdoorsman, and everybody in the community really loved him. I just thought that while we're in St. Demetrius, I should take a look around, because buried in this cemetery are other Palanicks, not from the same family, but Palanick is a very common name in Ukraine. You have people here who served in World War II, who served in the US military, who still had memories of Ukraine and knew that they probably couldn't go back because this was the middle of the Cold War. And it was fascinating to see the roots of the community spreading like the roots of Father Babersky's trees.
Do you know who that belongs to?
Family by the name of Dimiano.
When was the last time this was lived in?
Well, about 1963, the first dog I ever got came from this place, and the people were living in there. And there's a grain bin back here. When we leave, I'll show you. But I remember the guy came out of the house with the long hook and reached under the granary and snagged the puppy to pull him out.
Dang.
Yeah.
Is it all right to go in?
Go ahead.
And it's wild to think of a Ukrainian family moving over here and just making this.
Mm-hmm.
Sleeping on this bed.
After passing the old Ukrainian homestead, we headed up to the St. Josephat Ukrainian cemetery. This used to have a church next to it as well, but over the years, a lot of these churches are moved or kind of just fall into disrepair and become abandoned. But apparently, this is a resting place for a lot of military men, people who were killed in Korea or fought in World War II. If you look at all of the white crosses in the back, you can tell that back in the early 1900s, there was sort of a famine that went through and people were dying of disease and starvation.
And there was a famine here?
Well, a sickness, the plague, not a famine, a plague. And a lot of young children lost their lives.
Did that strike elsewhere in the country, or is that just here?
Pardon me?
Did the sickness or the plague strike elsewhere in the country?
Well, I think so. I believe it. Yeah. There's iron crosses like these in all the cemeteries that we're going to see today. When he was 6 years old, his father saw what an interest he had in music and bought him an accordion, and he played it wonderfully up until the day, almost to the day that he died. But his dad was one of the original immigrants who came to this country, and the way they came in on the eastern side of the state in Grand Forks, and they took a train out to the western side of the state. He got on the wrong train. He thought he was going to Belfield, North Dakota. He ended up in Belfield, South Dakota, which is probably 2-3 hours south. And he got off the train. He couldn't figure out why nobody was there to meet him, and then he found out that he was off by a few hundred miles. He walked from Belfield to Belfield barefoot.
Oh.
To come here for the free land, and that was Ernie's dad. Ernie just passed away a few weeks ago. He's a member of the North Dakota Ukrainian Hall of Fame, and just a good man. He was a very dear friend of mine.
And these are his relatives, first generation.
One of the first things that the Ukrainian immigrants did here was try to establish a unique sense of cultural identity out on the Great Plains. And one of the first communities they created was actually named Ukraina. And it was in Ukraina that the St. Demetrius Church was born. And eventually this church moved down the road, and the original settlement of Ukraina kind of withered away and became a ghost town, and now there's nothing really left of it other than 2 graveyards. And one is actually across the road from the Orthodox cemetery. So you can see separate religious congregations here, and throughout the cemetery as well, you also have a couple of fascinating examples of really well done wrought iron crosses of the same kind that you see from the Volga Germans or the Germans from Russia. It's an art style that's very famous throughout this region of western North Dakota.
And there's nothing left of Ukraina, is there?
This is Ukraina. There used to be a store here, a post office. St. Demetrius Church was over there. Yeah, we are in Ukraina.
And over in this clearing between the 2 cemeteries, the Orthodox and the Catholic, you have, it used to be the town of Ukraina. And it hasn't existed there since the 1940s, but they moved the church from Ukraina, which was the first one for Ukrainian immigrants coming over, up over the hill there. But this is the cemetery for St. Demetrius.
The first stop on our Ukrainian immigrant tour of North Dakota was the town of Walton, and a 1938 book written by the Works Progress Administration described it as a Ukrainian settlement, and although the town was created along the railroad, the immigrants arrived mostly after the initial construction looking for work in the coal mines, and from 1897 to 1899, 2 waves of immigrants from Galicia took up residence and built the town. Galicia was described in the book as a province of what used to be Austria-Hungary. We see here that they recognize the fact that these people are Ukrainians, but not the fact that Ukraine exists as an independent nation yet. When the town was settled, the two churches here were on opposite sides of the community, a Russian Orthodox church and the Saints Peter and Paul Greek Catholic Church, both meeting points for the Ukrainian community. Since the writing of this book, which was quite a while ago, the church has officially changed its sign from Greek Catholic to Ukrainian Catholic, although the message has been the same. The Russian Orthodox Church is now boarded up, and the roads have changed a lot since the Works Progress Administration wrote their guide to North Dakota. Like most towns built by immigrants in the late 19th century, the true main street straddled the old railroad. Many of the buildings were built by Ukrainians in the early 1900s, including the nice sports bar along the railroad. On the outskirts of town and on the prairie, you'll find a cemetery cut into 3 sections, one for each congregation. The first belongs to the Holy Trinity Orthodox Church, and there are many fewer graves here than in the other 2. Basarba is a name connected to many Ukrainian immigrant families in North Dakota. In fact, if you Google the phrase Basarba, Ukraine, most articles discuss the life of Ukrainian Americans from Dakota, many from near Belfield. In the back of the cemetery are graves from the Kyotor family, a very rare name. According to forebearers.io, only 176 people in the world actually have this surname, 114 in Ukraine and 47 in America. Also in the Orthodox cemetery is the Haluk family, a name of Turkish origin meaning good-natured. But a larger focus of the Ukrainian community seems to be the Saints Peter and Paul Church, which has a cemetery just next to this, and several wrought iron crosses in the back are reflective of Germans who settled in Ukraine before immigrating to America. The name Bodher, for example, derives from Middle High German Boden or bottom, and is used to describe a family who lived in a small cottage or at the floor of a valley. And in the back of the cemetery are the Makowski family, a name which Ancestry.com describes as Polish, Ukrainian, and Ashkenazi Jewish in origin, describing families who come from poppy fields. Skoropot family members in the back derive from Polish and Jewish skorupa, meaning shell, a name which indicated a secretive person. All over this cemetery you'll find the names in Ukrainian and even many graves still written in Cyrillic, which describe and sort of show the story of a continuing presence of Ukrainians. In fact, I asked a little bit at the bar, which is where I discovered where the cemetery was. It wasn't very well marked. And they mostly said, oh, my grandma was Ukrainian, or my great-uncle was Ukrainian, or, my great-great-grandma came directly from Ukraine. And a lot of these people are still very proud of their Ukrainian heritage.